Hello, good afternoon. I'm Abby Wolf, the Executive Director of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. And on behalf of Professor Henry Louis Gates Jr. and all of us at the Hutchins Center, it's a pleasure to welcome you to this space for John Thornton's Du Bois virtual lecture this afternoon, a rare event on a Wednesday afternoon. So we're so pleased to have John with us today.
Okay, well, hopefully we'll do better than we did on that start. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about today is about the general process of how African religions come to the Americas and what their fates are and how they adjust to this new environment on the other side of the ocean. But I'm going to spend a lot of my time talking about what we know now about African religions, their characteristics, and some of their historical examples and how they developed over time. I'm going to spend quite a bit of my time focusing on the specific religion of Vungu in Haiti, primarily because the documentation that we have on the African side supports a better look at the impact of the Kingdom of Dahomey and its neighboring areas on Haiti than it does for the Yoruba, who also have a big role to play in African religions in the Americas. So I'm going to start by that and say one of the keys and cores of my historical research over the years has been the Kingdom of Kongo, which is notable in particular for having converted to Christianity the year before Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1491. And so increasingly I've come to recognize that the fact that the Kingdom of Kongo was a Christian and a Catholic country, and that it contributed mightily, thanks to its civil wars, to the population of the African American world, that it has a role to play that's outsized relative to even its general contribution to the population. Actually, the idea that the Kingdom of Kongo was important in bringing at least Christianity with it to the Americas came out of a conference that Linda Haywood organized at Howard University back in 1999, which was called Bantu into Black. Cambridge University Press thought better to transfer that succinct phrase into this awkward title. And in that particular conference and in the book that followed, Terry Ray and Hein van Hay both presented papers, I think independently of each other, in which in one way or another they proposed that the development of the Catholic Church in Haiti owed a lot to the Kingdom of Kongo's Christianity. And that was a really important component. I was taken by that discussion, particularly because I was a part of the same journal or the same conference, but not doing that particular topic. And so in 2016, I published my first attempt to get the Congolese to bring the saints to Santeria. That paper on Cuba was for me an interesting part of the discussion, which was to understand that it was quite probably the Congolese Catholics who introduced Yoruba slaves, for example, to Christianity much more than the colonial church. And I'm now extending that and trying to take a look at that process in other parts of the Caribbean. So let me just say that we can start with the Kingdom of Kongo. Here it is in Central Africa. This is a relatively detailed map. And if you can imagine, this is the west coast of Africa, and that most of what you're seeing is now in Angola. So what I want to do is, first of all, make sure that we understand what exactly happened in the Kingdom of Kongo in the 15th century, because it's relevant for how this is going to develop forward. The Kingdom of Kongo was not a colony of anybody. In 1487, they sent a high-stakes, high-ranked embassy to Portugal. And that embassy was led by people of the highest Congolese nobility. They stayed in Portugal for a year and a half. While they were there, they stayed at the Church of St. John the Evangelist, where they were entertained for a year and a half by Vicente dos Anjos, who was a priest of that order. And one of the things that he did was he taught them to speak Portuguese, and they taught him to speak Kikongo, their language. In the process, according to Dos Anjos' biography, and decided to be baptized. They then returned to Congo in 1491, and immediately the Congolese elite converted. The priests that they brought with them were primarily there to perform the sacraments. The original chronicle doesn't even talk about any sort of educational process that the priests might have performed. Following that, the kings of Congo took the process of spreading Christianity into their own hands. Not so much the first Christian king, João Zinganku, but rather his son, Alfonso Mbanza, became the sort of apostle of Congo, as in fact one of the Portuguese writers of the time said. His process was to develop a whole series of lay ministers who were school teachers. In Portuguese language correspondence in Congo, they're called mestres de escola, or school teachers. Here you see an 18th century depiction of two of these mestres going out on their job. Alfonso describes this happening already in 1516 when he had a school built in his country, and the first graduates were already going out into the countryside. By 1530, they had formed a network in the entire country. And an Inquisition document from 1584 tells us that the priests who came to the country from outside did not do any instruction because that was already being done by natives of the country, prominent men who engaged in their education. That structure of mestres de escola that was spread throughout the country remained in place right through until the beginning of the colonial period. Witnesses from the 19th century talk about the mestres de escola still being there, still teaching. People who visited the country from outside would say there's been a place that hasn't seen an ordained priest in 30 or 40 years. The people still knew all the songs, they had all the prayers, they knew the gestures of the faith, they wore crucifixes and so on. I want to stress this because I know there's a lot of people who are saying, well, you know, this was superficial, it was just confined to the nobility, and so on. This is simply not true. What happens, though, was that, unfortunately, Alfonso hoped that his country would become a fully recognized Christian country, specifically with its own bishop, who would then ordain its own citizens as priests. Missionaries come to Congo to serve as priests. These missionaries were chosen to be Italians and of the Capuchin order, primarily because the Spanish king and the Portuguese king and the king of Congo had to agree on somebody that was neutral in any political disputes. And so the Capuchins are responsible for telling us a great deal about the Kingdom of Congo. They wrote thousands, maybe I think even tens of thousands of pages of text about Congo in the 17th and 18th century. It's certainly our primary source, the most detailed sources that we have about the history of the country. But these guys were also the foot soldiers of the Catholic Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, as you might call it. And one of their jobs had been in Europe and everywhere else in the world to crush what had been the medieval Christian church. The medieval Christian church in particular had a large group of sort of folk beliefs and magical beliefs that surfaced just below the regular Christian communities, and they went after that particular form of the religion. They met something very much like that in Congo, and they went after it there too. So their accounts are often negative in the sense that they describe them as being weak Christians or poor Christians, precisely because they continue to follow a lot of these, what I would call local traditions that were associated with a pre-existing Congolese church. And so it gave them, if you will, a bad reputation because although the Capuchin priests' primary role in the Kingdom of Congo was actually sacramental rather than educational. They did do education, but there weren't very many of them. They didn't educate that many people, but they did a lot of sacraments. They did tens of thousands of baptisms and thousands of marriages. And that's primarily what they were there to do. But it gave the Congo a reputation which has passed into modern historiography of being a country that really wasn't a particularly, strongly Christian country or a Catholic country. So what I want to do now is I want to talk a little bit about the nature of the Christianity in the Kingdom of Congo, and especially to talk about what we would consider the traditional religion which Christianity overlaid. When Linda organized the conference that I just mentioned, Bantu into Black, she gave me the assignment of trying to figure out what the base religion of West Central Africa was, using contemporary sources and other types of sources. So what I did to do this was a couple things. First of all, I took very detailed descriptions that were fortunately in the record of the Kingdom of Luango, which lay to the north of Congo. Here you see it. This was an area that spoke the same Kikongo language, but was never Christianized. and we have a really good 17th century description of their religious traditions that was done by a man named Abraham Valarch, who was a Dutch fine artist that came to Angola in 1641 with an explicit mission of documenting the customs of the people in the country. His work was published then by Alfred Dapper in 1668. And so he took the trouble to sort of ask people a lot of questions and then although he was a Christian and thought maybe they were a little diabolical, he did describe the religion fairly well. I also used the work of Antonio Cavazzi, who worked in this region. Again, not so much because Cavazzi was anything special, except that he did write a lot about the local religion. So I tried to sort of combine those things together. I added to that the denunciations that the Capuchin missionaries made about the customs that were still surviving in the Kingdom of Congo. And then finally, I added the work of modern ethnographers, both European ethnographers, and Congo has a fairly strong tradition of what I call self-ethnographers, people who are from the country who write treatises on their religious tradition. So bundling all that together, I came up with a picture of what we might call the traditional West Central African religion. Okay, so let me just run down what that would involve. So first of all, I have to say that like other religions of Africa, the religion of West Central Africa was continuously revealed. This is a term which I coined in African Africans to describe the way in which religious knowledge reached people. It didn't reach people through what I call a discontinuous revelation, which would be a major religious event like the delivery of the scriptures. Typically, discontinuous revelations are scriptural traditions. Or they have fixed memorized texts, like, for example, the Rig Veda during its pre-literate period, or the Buddhist writings before those were set down. It's possible that they can be translated verbatim that way, but that kind of tradition wasn't really found in Africa. Instead, people expected the other world, the spiritual world, to reveal itself to them on a continuous basis. Not necessarily in big dramatic events, but in a massive number of small events. When people went to ask the other world for a petition of some kind or another, was that delivered to them? Were they able to protect themselves from their enemies, for example, by requesting this from the other world? Because it was continuously revealed, it didn't have a strong dogma of its own. It wasn't a tradition that insisted that certain types of things be done or certain places were sacred. Rather, those places could easily come and go, depending on whatever happened. So it could be that the spiritual power that was once found in this grove of trees is no longer there for reasons we don't know. And so that's what we get. So in this particular environment, we find is, first of all, there is some concept of a divine, of a higher God. In this case, the discovery of this higher god, named him Vungu, is, however, a remote force. The big, if we want to say divine, sort of higher level spiritual entities that we find in this area, those type of deities, I'm going to call them deities and gods, coexisted with the cult of the ancestors. The idea that when people die, their souls go somewhere in the other world. But what's significant about them is that their souls in the other world have power in this world. And they use that power to help and sometimes to punish their descendants. And so this ancestral idea was very much there. The Catholic Church in Congo incorporated at least part of that ancestor into the celebration of All Souls Day or All Saints Day, where they would hold a midnight vigil at the graves of their ancestors over what we would call Halloween today. And then in the morning, they would come and say Mass on behalf of them. And that wasn't, of course, the only way they propitiated their ancestors, but it was the way it got incorporated into Christianity. In addition to that, we also had a lot of what I guess we could call relatively minor spiritual entities. They weren't the big territorial gods, but they were minor spiritual entities who were not necessarily assigned to any particular place or people. They may have been the souls of some people who got lost from their ancestral stages, or just souls that were naturally found in nature. And these particular entities, however, while they might not be very significant cosmologically, they're very significant in terms of people's daily life. And what would happen typically is that a person who had the capacity to work with those spirits, oftentimes it meant to be possessed by those spirits, would make some kind of a spiritual receptacle. Sometimes these were called amulets, they were called fetishes sometimes. They might be called charms. These are all terms that are used for them. I like sort of spiritual vessel. And typically some kind of spirit would be captured or enticed to live in that vessel, and it would provide protection or whatever the person who made it intended for it to do. And there were recipes for these things. Here are some religious medals. These are the kind of things that a Christian might have, but typically these would also be mixed with things that the missionaries would have considered to be pagan or superstitious or even diabolical. Other ingredients which are put together in assemblages. And I want to sort of recognize here the work of Cécile Froment and Matthew Rary, who have been talking about assemblages as, particularly in the concept of the Bolsa Mandinga. It's one of the various types of assemblages that we find elsewhere in the Atlantic world, in which sacred objects and then also special objects which are going to have specific ways to capture particular types of spirits are placed into some sort of physical object. It doesn't have to be a pouch like a Bolsa de Mandinga. It could be a small physical item. It could be what people might have called an idol, or any manner of other kinds of things. And these were the things that people used to help them in their daily lives. And even though they're not, as I said before, terribly important from a theological point of view, they do play a big role in what people are doing. Okay, so this is sort of a quick background to what we meet in West Central Africa. This leaves us now to contemplate for a minute what happens to Africans from these various religious environments as they cross over the Atlantic Ocean and come to the New World. Well, for most of them, they will have left virtually all spiritual help behind them. Their ancestors are buried in their graves back in Africa. The territorial deities which might have given them fertility and wealth and weather and so on, they're also local. They're not crossing the ocean. They're staying back in Africa as well. And so they're coming to an environment where basically they have no idea what the spiritual universe is going to be like. But they suspect, and this is my speculation obviously, they suspect that there will be local deities of one kind or another. There'll probably be territorial deities there, and there may very well be those helpful, lesser spiritual entities which can be captured in receptacles and held as amulets and so on. The task will simply be to locate them. They're not expecting to find anything African over here, but they're going to find something that they can use. Well, one of the things, of course, they almost always realized was that there were clearly shrines. There was a shrine god in the Americas, and his name was Jesus or God, and he lived in a church. In Protestant countries, those who went to Protestant countries quickly discovered that very often Protestants did not want to share this deity with them. They wouldn't allow them to be baptized. They wouldn't allow them to come to church, which doesn't mean that they necessarily rejected it. They simply thought, okay, that's not for us. Maybe we can access that at some point, but right now that's not for us. So in areas like Jamaica, in particular, I'm just using that as an example, essentially what they did was they turned to people among them who were capable of capturing or using local deities and made them into locally useful things. And we have essentially a tradition like that of Obia. So Obia doesn't recognize gods. It doesn't recognize territorial deities, as far as we can see. There in some Jamaican texts from this period, we do hear Yankompong, the high god of the Akan, being mentioned. But basically, what they're using is the local spiritual entities. And we can see from, for example, the documentation about Obia men, people who had the skill to be able, or the capacity to be possessed and to be able to capture and rotate or use those local spiritual entities to their own ends. And so oftentimes a person could be convicted of Obia if they possessed certain types of objects, alligator teeth, cat's paws, and interestingly enough, thunderstones. So I mentioned thunderstones because it's come to me through the work of Amara Thornton, who is an archaeologist or historian of archaeology, and she's been doing work on the collection of indigenous archaeological objects by collectors living in the West Indies in the 18th and 19th centuries. And among their many discoveries were what are called in those days thunderstones. What they actually are is they're Carib or Arawak or Taino religious objects that have been excavated. She found this out from her research, excavated often by the Africans for the purposes of using these obia stuff. And so the thunderstones are interesting because this gives you a real clear idea that they're looking for the local territorial entities. They're looking for the local entities at all. And they're presuming that the original inhabitants of this region, who are represented archaeologically, are also the people who they can contact. So having thunderstones in there, and it turns out they're all over the Caribbean. When you look at these kinds of religious packages where they're mentioned or where they're described in court records, thunderstones are often in there. That's the term for an archaeological object that was used in Europe, expressing a different folk belief. Now, for those who come to Catholic countries, and here I'm speaking, of course, of Saint-Domingue, it's a different story. First of all, there's no barrier to them being baptized. In fact, what we know from the church, the records of the priests who worked there, I'm using to begin Pierre-Charles Chalevoix, who writes a history of the Jesuit mission in Saint-Domingue. And essentially, what they say, first of all, they baptize everybody immediately. Everybody's baptized, and therefore everybody's eligible to go to church. However, it's a problem for them because the Jesuit priests are very much restricted in how much access they can have to actually educate people. Instead, the security regulations that are in effect in Saint-Domingue are so stringent that they're not allowed to, basically Africans weren't allowed to go to church, or it was very difficult for them to go to church. And very often the priests were not allowed to go with them. And so we have actually complaints, arrêts in the archives that say that they also are not allowed to catechize each other, which I thought is an interesting statement, and it brings me to an important point. And that is that we know, for example, from a remarkable work by the Moravian missionary Christoph Georg Andreas Oldendorp, who he came to the Virgin Islands in the middle of the 18th century with the task of figuring out how to evangelize the slaves. And one of the things he wanted to do was figure out what language to use. So he interviews hundreds of slaves, and in the process he gives us little mini biographies of some of them, and he asks them all kinds of questions about their homelands. What was their religion in their homelands? What was it like? What was their name for God? How did they bury the dead? And then what they were doing in the West Indies. So it's a remarkable text in this regard, only published in 2000. And what Oldendorp has is he says that among the Congolese who are in his island, there are a number of people who in fact engage in baptizing newly arrived slaves. He says he believes they were priests in Congo, and that they were Catholics, and that they had a sort of a ceremony when new slaves arrived. They would go down to meet them in a boat. They would give them a little slap on the face for the sins they had committed in Guinea, and baptize them in Kikongo. The word for baptism is kutiamungwa, which means to eat salt. And so the salt in the mouth and the slap on the face, that's all part of the process. And then they would baptize them in that way. And he says it was not just one or two people, but he knew there was a number of people who were doing this kind of thing. So there's a sort of a tradition of proselytization by Congolese of other people around them. There's also an Inquisition case in Brazil, about the same time as Oldendorp, of a man named Pedro Congo. We can figure out where he came from, who was caught conducting mass for a large number of slaves from Mina, which was the Yoruba-speaking area. And he was apparently dressed in a proper priest's outfit, and he was intoning apparently in Latin. He got in trouble with the Inquisition for that, although it's not clear that he was punished very strongly for it. But again, it's another example of how we might imagine that the Congos are basically explaining Christianity to other people. And for those people, it's important to recognize they're looking to contact higher deities. It's not like they don't want to. And these are people who can tell them how to do that and what to expect and what to look for. And so they introduce basically the saints to those folks. Okay. So it's probably no mistake that much of the vocabulary of the amulet making that we meet, for example, there was a celebrated case in Saint-Domingue in 1758 of a man named Macandal, who was accused of a huge poisoning scheme. And he was tried, and there was a little bit of evidence about what he did and what he said. It was pretty clear that he may have been doing some poisoning, but he was also doing a lot of healing and the kind of thing that we would expect somebody who could capture these spirits was doing. And the vocabulary of Makandal's stuff was mostly in Kikongo. And I think that that's probably true, because I think that what you had was there were people who had the capacity to do this, who weren't Congos, of course, but the Congos were the ones that helped them to wed that to Christianity. So they were the ones that are likely to provide vocabulary. It's not a slam dunk. It's not everybody. It's not all the vocabulary, but it may explain the predominance of that particular tradition there.
John, that was fabulous.
Thank you.
Amazing. Is Barbaro coming on? And Alejandro? Great, Alejandro, thank you for that marvelous introduction. Is Barbaro there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Beautiful. Alejandro, John, as Alejandro said, I talk to you and Linda, sometimes when I'm doing a project every day, even if I'm in Africa. So I wanted to defer. I'll ask my questions later if we run out. I have a feeling that we won't, but there is one sort of a question that's come up as I've lectured. I started to say around the country, but I haven't left my kitchen table. But I've given a zillion lectures about the Black church, and as you know, we were blessed, as Black people would say, the response to the Black church. And even in the reviews, people point to the fact, as one of the surprises of the series, drawing on your work, among others, is that the percentage of the enslaved Africans who were Muslim, practicing Muslim, and Congolese Catholics who came to North America through the United States. And it's generated an enormous amount of discussion and almost awe. And you would think that people would know about the Muslims, because at least since Alan Austin, when I was a baby professor at Yale, John Blaskingham and I were editing a series, and we published his collection of Muslim slave narratives. So you would think that that would be in circulation, but not so much knowledge of Congolese Catholicism. And now that we have the transatlantic slave trade database, we know how many enslaved Africans, more or less, came from Congo, Angola, how many came from Senegambia, et cetera, et cetera. We could begin to triangulate. How about Cuba? I'm curious, student of Cuba, and obviously my wife's a great scholar of Cuban history and the slave trade. And we talk a lot about this issue. Where the Muslims, how come the Muslims came to the United States and left a written record in Arabic, and they didn't do so, as far as I know, in Cuba? And what about the relationship between the Congolese Catholics and the population that show up on the island of Cuba? Though I know it's most of the enslaved people came to Cuba after Haiti was born and after the slave trade was abolished in 1808. But I'm just curious about the differences between Cuba and the United States, or Haiti, Cuba, and the United States, however you want to put it.
One thing that I thought was fascinating about your talk is these references to sort of Congos explaining Christianity, and this case that you mentioned of Pedro Congo in Brazil. And it made me think of a recent book, I don't know if you've read it, by Larissa Brewer Garcia, Beyond Babel. It's a very recent book, it came out last fall. And what she does is to study how African translators played a key role for Jesuit priests in places like Cartagena de India and Lima and stuff.
In fact, because so many of those interpreters testified at the Inquisition for his or investigation of his sainthood, you could probably even figure out what his name was. What's interesting about it, of course, is that when they decided to translate, the word they used for God was voodoo, and the word they used for Jesus was Lisa. So Lisa is, if we look at Oldendorp, who's a century after this, but Oldendorp does mention Lisa as among the deities found in in that greater region, who he actually identifies him as a white Negro. So presumably Jesus was white and male, and Voodoo was black and female, or something like that. And I think that kind of thing, man, this is a unique piece of evidence. I don't know how much farther we can go with that, but I'm pretty sure that that's what's going on. I mean, everybody's translating, all these interpreters are translating to other people in their own language, and they're having to find the spiritual vocabulary that they work with. And apparently they're not necessarily restricted from using local terms. I mean, you might just say you have to call God Dios and Jesus Jesus, because we want to distinguish that from any deity that you might have, but obviously that doesn't happen. And I'm imagining that the ones who are working with Mandingas and Congas and all these other groups of people are not necessarily deciding to go with the Spanish or Latin term. But again, that's a speculation, except that we do have this one catechism, and even then I can't prove that it was an interpreter who did this, but I just have a feeling it was.
Great. Barbaro? Oh, by the way, Alejandro, what is the name of that? Not After Babel, that's George Steiner's book. What is it?
Beyond Babel.
Oh, okay.
Beyond Babel, okay.
Got it. Barbaro?
Yeah, thank you, Thornton. I think finally we just see face to face digitally. I think in the beginning of your presentation, you kind of paint a very loose structure and ephemeral organizations of the Congo, the way Congo, the traditional historical Congo religion, and you claims using historical sources to to arrive to the kind of conclusion in opposition. It's the way it sounds to me. In opposition is a well-oiled and organized understanding of Catholicism. That kind of contradictions that was kind of part of your beginning of your presentation. And going back to record from Kawasi, there are specific reference about the organization of the Congo religion, the historical religion. I reference to Simbi, not just Sambi and Pungo Tulendo. There's a specific structure, specific names about practices. You can find in someone like Laman, who spent 35 years of his life and write the most comprehensive set of research on the Congo from an outsider. We have a German doctor, Fortune Loss, going to the 19th century, also writing about traditional medicines in that particular. We have the record from George Grenfell, who was the founder of a Baptist church in the Mbanza Kongo, who in 1930 organized the burnings of 1,000 traditional objects, and he did 5 years later. I mean, we have in 1930 is such a vital practice of a Congo religion, what the people in Mbanza Kongo call Makisinsi, and someone like Jansen's already studied those kind of tradition, those kind of formations. But my question is how you can narrate a different kind of story of a formation of religion, historical religion, outside those traditional historical sources, European sources. It is possible to do that. It's possible to interview people that are practitioners. The way you describe the religion, I born and practice a religion since I was over 50. I spent all my life in that religion, and the way you explain it to me sounds so strange. I couldn't understand the way you describe the basic principle of the Congo religions, and that for me is I'm struggling to understand the way you frame the basic principle of the religion, and even there is a way in which we can do a comparison between practitioners of the Congo religion in the diaspora in places like Cuba, Haiti, or Brazil, with the way the understanding of the Zen tradition or similar tradition back in Angola or in the Congo. Without this kind of conversation, I think would be almost impossible for me to picture, to have a better picture of what the religion looked like, only with realizing those sources that are back in centuries before. I don't know, it's a question, but it's a comment.
Well, let me just say that one of the strategies I've always used as a historian is to try to work with the expectation that civilizations, cultures, and religions change over time. And if that's to be demonstrated, then the only way we can do that is talk to people who lived in those times. And of course, we can't interview them today, so we have to take whatever they send us. And then hopefully we'll come to some truth for that. So the approach I took in the article that I wrote for Linda Haywood's book was a threefold approach, which is that I read a number of the self-ethnography kinds of things, like the Le Mans Cahiers. I'm sure you know these. These publications, and also works by people who are associated with I guess you might say modern Congo religions. I've looked at that work as well, but I've also tried to take a look at what we get from the old sources. And granted, these people are foreigners. Many of them are not necessarily terribly well versed in the languages, although some of them are. They're also, of course, dealing in a country, if they're in the Kingdom of Kongo, in which a significant number of the nobility speak Portuguese and read and write Portuguese. So we don't know necessarily exactly how they interact with who they interact with and where they get their understandings from. It's the historian's dilemma. We can't interview people in the 17th century today, barring seance or something like that. So that's just the methodology I had to use. And I mean, it's difficult to imagine the Kingdom of Kongo not evolving given the manifold numbers of people who witnessed what was going on, at least the practice of Christianity in that country. I want to make it clear too that this was a locally organized church. It was not really the work of the missionaries. The missionaries there were primarily to perform the sacraments. They certainly did educational tasks, and they wrote no small number of denunciations. The denunciations tell us a little bit about what the local religion was like. But we know that the church itself, that is to say the Congo church, tolerated and acknowledged all of the sort of things that the missionaries didn't approve of. Which is why they survived. I imagine if Alfonso had actually had his goal and he'd been able to ordain all his own people as priests and so on, maybe it would have developed in a different way. Maybe it would have been more like the sort of orthodoxy. But you have to remember the church in Congo was born in the medieval times. It was born before the Reformation. And when the witnesses who tell us the most arrive, they're part of that Reformation or the Counter-Reformation. They're going to war with exactly those kinds of practices in Europe that we're meeting in Central Africa. And so, we're stuck with sort of having to deal with that. We don't have a lot of a contrary different type of evidence. So sure, you can go to, I'm proposing that, let's say that the traditional religion in Congo has changed through the impact of, the only part of this region I know is Angola. It's changed through the impact of Christian missionization in the colonial period. One of the things I was struck with whenever I go to Mbanza Kongo is that people are convinced that the Kingdom of Kongo was simply a colony and that the Portuguese had imposed this religion the way they were imposing it in the colonial period when they really did control that region, and that there's a reaction to that. So, and I'm not saying I don't know how much comes through all of that to the present day, but speaking as a historian, I work with historical texts I can deal with.
No, I understand. I understand the argument about religion change. But religion changed. In Mbanza Kongo in 1999, it used to have only 8,000 people. Now you will have the city have over 150,000 people. You can imagine how the changes that take place in a population and that growth in 10, 15 years or 20 years. But what we know is still, even from Grenfell, the need to destroy that traditional religion by burning objects, and something we have a systematic burning for 500 years. Despite that, what the Angolan called Maquizinci, that is almost like underground, almost illegal by the government. Still, there are more than 50 Nganga Mauku in Mbanza Kongo. And now you can have access to them because the government forced them to register and pay fees to have a license to practice today. But even we can go back before that the government made those decisions to supervise and police traditional religion because they are suspicious for the governments that have these. They are suspicious about traditional religion because they think traditional religion they are associated with revolts and splitting the country and unifying the Bakongo with the Congo from the DRC. But what I try to if we realize in all these resources we have, there are more than 90 sites with rock paintings around in Mbanza Kongo. There is 2 different graphic writing systems. The Bakongo have their own writing system. They have their own books called Makaba in the Bundu dia Congo, in which they write their own history. And it seems to me not to look those kind of evidence way to understand history is quite dangerous. Well, you have a Lumbu, they have those tradition of songs that go back almost 400 years. They use song to remember history in the Lumbu until today. And if not paying attention to those kind of information, for me, is quite dangerous. But if we don't have this conversation between the traditional religion in Mbanza Kongo or in Kinshasa or in Mbanza Ngungu, but what happened in the diaspora, in the other side. I can tell you for someone who practiced that religion, the principle, of course the religion changed, but the principle is still connected, still related. The upside, the superficial corresponds, they do not match, but the principle of the religion, they are similar, and only until you get into those spaces, you will be able to understand. You can ask a voice like someone from Fukiao Bunseki, when you have someone like Jansen in 1967 explaining the importance to understand someone from that particular tradition who has the right to tell the whole history. And we made the decision not to include his own voice could be quite dangerous to me. But even that, Bakongo people, the practitioner of Congo religion in Cuba, they self-published book since the beginning of the 20th century. And you can find in every single botanica in Boston, in Los Angeles, in New York, in Miami. But you have a scholar who already collect those notebooks that they use, a practitioner used to record their own religious development throughout her life, like someone like Lydia Cabrera or Fernando Ortiz. But even that, the Bakongo people today, or practitioners of the Congo religion, are still publishing their own books. You can get online, and they still, the story, they have to do nothing with the Catholic Church whatsoever. That, it just, maybe the question is about what is history? What constitutes a history? And the choices we made as a scholar to silence certain voices could be quite dangerous.
John, you want to respond?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I know how to respond exactly. I do know that people visited the Kingdom of Kongo, throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, and what they reported was a great devotion to the Catholic Church. It doesn't mean at all that they abandoned everything from the other tradition. Indeed, that's exactly what we're talking about, is the survival of that other tradition integrated into the way that the Congolese in particular practice Christianity. And now the missionaries tell us that very explicitly. Yes, they burned the objects. There's no question about it. But that doesn't mean that the church itself didn't support those objects. These people had their role. Typically, the way in which they did so is they would say these are being used for witchcraft. And certainly, this is always a capacity within the Congo tradition that a person can use spiritual forces to harm others. And that's Ndoki, that's witchcraft. And so there's certainly possible that that's going on. And that's generally speaking the language they speak. They understood that religious tradition as consistently and continuously being witchcraft. This is what missionary priests did. That's why they use words like superstition and fetichero and so on, because those are terms that relate to witchcraft. Congolese would also agree that it's possible that such a thing could be used for witchcraft, and they might support burning it for that reason. The question is only the degree, and generally speaking, they tolerated the missionaries because they wanted them to perform the sacraments. And so they put up with them, and these guys didn't come around very often. They came around once a year. If they were lucky, they'd have a missionary come, or a priest would come and baptize the children. Many times they waited many years. Many times they never got baptized at all because they never had a priest that they saw that could do it. But I mean, the fact is that this is just the way I understand what was going on back then. And I don't see that what you're talking about today is necessarily different. If you go to Mbanza Kongo today or anywhere, you certainly people or practicing Christians, they may do many other things as well. They may annex that to there. But I mean, certainly you can find people who are also rejecting all of that in Angola and everywhere else, because that's how religions change, and that's how they evolve. And so,
and we're talking about an evolutionary period of 530 years. I mean, over the King of Congo converted to Catholicism in 530 years ago, right? So it's over half a millennium of evolution between that conversion and, Barbara, you said when you were 15, right? You were started practicing religion. Is that what I heard you say?
3.
When you were 3, I couldn't hear you.
Yeah, I was 3, and I'm over 50, and that's what I tried to say. I'm over 50.
That you're what, over 50 now?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, I thought that, but I didn't need the translation on that part.
Yeah.
But the two things are not mutually exclusive, and you know, Barbara, better as well as I do. It's difficult to date an oral tradition precisely, but you know, we know that oral traditions are old. But how a thing evolved between 530 years ago and your 3rd birthday, that's, you know, there is a lot of time for change there. By the way, Bob Thompson used to bring, he would say Foucault, but you say Foucault?
Foucault.
Yeah, I met him, had dinner with him several times because Thompson would bring him to Yale at the beginning of my career. So we had, I had the benefit of hearing him talk and, you know, being translated more or less by Thompson. So that's quite fascinating. Abby, should we open it up?
Yes, there are a lot of questions, so I'm not going to do my usual grouping and moving around. And I do want to say that it has just started storming where I am, and there's a lot of thunder and lightning. So if I lose power, Matt Weinberg will take over for me, and it'll be seamless. So,
well, it rained like hell in Cambridge about an hour ago.
Okay, well, it's moved out here now.
Good. I hope it moves to your and Alejandro's house and gets away from Marielle and my house.
Well, it's at my house at least. Can't speak for Alejandro's. But so, John, thank you so much for this, and thank you, Alejandro and Barbara, also for your insights and questions as well, and Skip too, of course. There are a lot. I want to say there was a lot of just appreciation being expressed by the audience for the education we're all receiving, including from a journalist named Jim Dingman, who covered modern Angola for many years. And he says that this conversation is very helpful to him. I also wanted to note that Marielle Iglesias, whom Skip mentioned, did send a note kind of echoing, I think, a lot of what Barbara has just been saying. I don't know if you want to respond further to it or not. She says, you're using written sources, mostly from European missionaries and scholars, as evidence. Are those kinds of colonial sources reliable when it comes to the indigenous religious beliefs? I don't know if you have anything to add to that at this point.
Yeah.
John, you have to answer that. That's my wife.
That's why I put the question.
Well, I mean, it is a fact that the Congolese elite has been literate since the 15th century. And that was what as Mestre de Escola was all about. Unfortunately, most of what they wrote hasn't survived for us. Archives have been destroyed. I personally believe there are archives in Angola today which go back at least to the 18th century. But right now we can't put our hands on them. And that's how it works. But I mean, we can say from the documentation on the African side that we have, it is, needless to say, pretty much Christian oriented, even when it deals with internal affairs. So for example, in 1550, King Diogo had an inquest into a treasonous plot against him. And he organized an inquest, and he had sworn testimony by people from the Congo. So everybody who was testifying was Congo. And to the degree they talked about religious affairs, which they didn't do much, they did, however, at least bring an African voice to the game. One of the things that they noted, of course, was that Diogo's rival, Pedro, had taken refuge in a church, and that this was considered sufficiently important that the king, even though it was his mortal enemy, would not break ecclesiastical sanctuary for that rebel against him. There's also references to people swearing oaths. Again, these are Christian oaths. And this is not in a colonial context. This inquest was conducted in the Kingdom of Congo about a Congolese affair with Congolese witnesses. And I mean, many of them are from the elite. Then we get, of course, the many different letters that come from Congolese people as well. Antonio Alvaro's ambassador to Rome left 70 documents of his own. Many of those are religious documents. Although again, they're all into what we would consider the Christian, or at least the mystical tradition. He has some things that we would describe as mystical, maybe with a Carmelite twist to them. He had served himself as a schoolmaster. Antonio Manuel had. He had certificates from the King of Congo and from officials in the Congolese government giving him appointments and letters and so on. So I mean, I don't think we should be taken over by the idea that our written records are just from European sources. And then secondly, even if they are, I mean, historians are forever reading sources that are hostile to the subject being discussed. And when we try to judge the veracity of what they say and also how much they know about what they're talking about, we do have to recognize they have experiences in those regions. This is the historian's task, is to take a look at people who are long dead and are the only people who can talk to us from those times. And we don't get to ask them questions and get answers or cross-examine them. We just have to have what they give us. I'm personally quite suspicious of imagining that a religious tradition that's continuously revealed will remain absolutely static over periods of time. It's going to pass from generation to generation and from revelation to revelation. Revelation takes different forms at different times. It doesn't necessarily have to be fixed in all time. It's not a dogmatic tradition. That's, I think, the main point. So it would be surprising if we should find some sort of a dogmatic continuity through several hundred years.
Great. Actually, on that subject, or reminds me of this question, the scholar Cheryl Townsend Gilks has thanks you for teaching her new terms as tools for her own work, especially co-revelation. And her question is, do you know, or is there any indication that people who were deported to the New World in the Middle Passage could have been practitioners who were disruptive of the Catholicism in Congo and were specifically targeted for deportation for that reason?
You can be sure that people were deported if they were disruptive of anything in the political order. That's the nature of what goes on in a place like that. And yes, we know that, in fact, people who were, for example, when there were Catholic priests that were in authority to do so, they would arrest people, and the Congolese state would agree to that arrest, and they would deport them. And so, yeah, those people went to America. It's not exactly from Congo, but Cavazzi tells an interesting story in which he knew two famous Nganga, this was in the Kimbundu-speaking area, who had made a lot of trouble, and they deported them to Brazil. When they got to Brazil, the governor recognized them and sent them back. And so they ended up coming back to Angola. So yes, in fact, the people who are the ones who do the discovery in the New World are precisely these kinds of people, whether they were deliberately deported or whether they were simply caught up in the massive deportations. There's a priest in Martinique who actually did a census of his community. He said there were 2,400 people in his community, and 26 of them were sorcerers. So I'm assuming that those people he's defining as sorcerers are actually people who have the kind of technique and skill to be able to discover whatever spiritual entities are out in their environment there in America, and to be able to operate with them, to be able to make charms or amulets or other kinds of ways that they can use to protect people in their environment. I mean, we have lots and lots of sort of casual references to sorcerers in other sources, not quantitative like that one, but certainly this was something that was recognized, that those type of people with those skills would be the ones that would be targeted in this particular environment. If they were deported for religious crimes in Africa, it's likely because they were accused of witchcraft.
Thank you. I may mispronounce something in this question, so forgive me if I do. There's some cross-pollination in the language group of Phone Yoruba. Is which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Ewe.
Okay, Ewe. Okay, is Ewe linguistic spiritual group incorporated in the Phone Yoruba religious influence across the Atlantic? So
there's an interesting study by Bonaventure Yai, he's no longer with us, Olabia Yai, of what he calls the language of Mina. So in Brazil, Mina was a generic term for people who came from the Costa de Mina, which is the coast that has the Dahomey, Alada, Huida, and so on. And also Minas might be described as people from the Yoruba region, although they might be named other ways as well. And in this language, Yai is able to detect multiple dialects within the words that are in the text. And this isn't surprising, I think, because basically what you're having is you have people who speak related languages, maybe different dialects of different languages, and between them they create a lingua franca that they can all understand. This is a wonderful text because it demonstrates how that process takes place. They're still working within mutually intelligible languages or slightly mutually intelligible languages. I mean, I can say that, for example, for me, if I hear people speaking Kimbundu, I can understand maybe 3/4 of what they say because it has a lot of commonality with Kikongo. On the other hand, people from the other side of the Congo River speaking what they say is Kikongo, I have a harder time understanding. But I think that those are relatively minor issues. People resolve them. A lot of times just getting used to phonological differences between one language and another. And maybe, there's idiomatic and grammatical mistakes that you would make as you do that, but people can get through that. I remember once I gave a talk in Brazil and apologized at the end of my talk for my terrible Portuguese. And one of the members of the audience said that if you have vocabulary and enthusiasm, you don't need grammar. And I've always liked that particular expression because a lot of times you can figure out the vocabulary. The grammar, you can figure that out without much, we don't need nearly the grammar that we get to use. So I think this is what happens in the other world. You do get a lot of people who are trying to communicate with each other. And maybe they end up all learning a same language, likely the colonial language or Pidgin. They have a Pidgin language that they speak. But even, if they're in the same language family, I mean, it's like, for example, you had, say, Spanish and Portuguese people together, they probably figure out how to speak Portuñol.
Yeah, I think what you just said hurts my grammarian's heart, but I agree with I know that what you're saying is true. So Miller Boyd has a couple of questions. I think they're short, so I'll ask them both. He thanks you for this wonderful talk and says, is there a direct or indirect connection between the snake deities of Ouida and the Haitian Lua, Dambala? And also, isn't the Arabic name for Jesus Isa?
Okay, well, I'll shout out to Miller Boyd, who was a student at BU some years ago. We keep in touch every so often. And I'm glad for his question. And certainly Dambala is related to the same snake deity in Ouida, exactly. That is reported as his name by Oldendorp, who's actually the first source to mention the name of that deity that we have. And he also has variants on it. So there's Daboy and there's several other variants on it. I imagine these are dialect variations wherever he goes. And as for Arabic and Jesus and Isa, that's a very good point. The fact that Muslims recognize the prophecy well, they would say the prophecy of Jesus is a part of their normal religious life, makes it very easy for Muslims to be able to deal with Christianity. I think that, you know, following the Muslims will be an interesting task for us. And as I hope that Alejandro is right, and that we'll find more evidence of Muslims in Cuba. One thing I do know from the research I've done is that both the Spanish and the Portuguese make detailed records of everything they do. However, the Portuguese lose their records and the Spanish keep theirs. So if you want to know something about anything, go to a country that has Spanish as their language. If you're in a Portuguese speaking area, you might find something great, but it won't be consistent. But if you go to the Spanish areas, it will be consistent. I just remember working in the archives in Cuba and having a document of about 300 or 400 folios. And Alejandro knows how the archives are there. And all the pages were kind of stuck together. And so I had to sort of lift it up just so to peek inside, and desperately afraid that I would, you know, break it. But yet there it was, you know, and this is a marvelous document because it was the record of a cabildo that was the Congo cabildo, and they had actually had sub units in this cabildo, and they correspond to the 3 sub-dialects of Kikongo. That is to say, the dialect that's spoken in the old Kingdom of Congo. There was a Solongo cabildo, and there was I think they called it a Congo one, and then they called one they called Zombo, and you still hear those names today. People will tell you the difference between the Zombo dialect and the Sansala dialect and the Solongo dialect, which aren't terribly great, but it's distinctive. You know one when you hear it.
Moving to music, there are a couple of questions about music. Alan Ornelas asks, are there any sources that reference music from Congo before and after Catholic influence? And Andrea Guerrero Mosquera, who sends greetings from Mexico, is asking if you can tell us a bit about the relationship between musical instruments and religion.
Yeah, well, shout out to Andrea. I was on her committee at the University of Mexico. I'm glad to hear from her and that she's on board. So musical instruments, and well, this is a fascinating topic in its own right. So one of the things that came to Congo along with Christianity was also Christian music. However, when you take a look at pictures, for example, of a priest saying mass, and I think there's in fact in the publicity for this particular event, there's a picture of a priest saying mass. And if you look at the parishioners back there, they're playing a marimba, a drum, and a or what do you call it, a horn. And it's really going to be difficult not to Africanize that music with that combination of instruments present, the drums, the marimba, and so on. The Jesuits claimed that when they were preaching in Sao Salvador, Mbanza Kongo, that they taught songs that caused lions and lions to keep away from the country. And when they stopped singing, the lions came back and ate people. I don't know if that's really true, but we do hear accounts, for example, of people singing, what do you call it, polyphonically, which would be a European import. I have a fascinating reference, which I would really like to know with regards to the musical traditions in the area. And that is that a French missionary working in what would be the Solongo speaking area in the 1870s says that they had a particular type of Christian music, which didn't sound like anything he'd ever heard in Africa or in Europe. And I'm wondering if that wasn't Congo musicians taking, let's say, a Catholic hymn and repackaging it with their instruments and with their musical sensibilities, and then playing it that way. And I'm one of the things I'm wondering about is just exactly what kind of impact that type of repackaging of Christian music in Africa and then translating to the Americas might have had on the development of African-American music, or particularly spirituals. But of course, unless we had sheet music or some kind of recording device, or somebody recorded in recent times songs that seem like they came from that period, or that the priest himself might have made musical notations. But as far as I know, none of that happened. So it'll maybe remain a mystery until we find out more about it. But certainly the thing about music is that while individual people might be very channeled with regards to what they want in music, musicians themselves are often incredibly open about what influences they'll take. And they're musicians, you know, they have to please an audience. And so they're listening to what people like. And if they can bring something that they'd heard from somewhere down the road and bring it into their music and repurpose it, they might win their audience over. I think this is the reason why African-American music, I speak it broadly here to refer to all of the Americas, is so popular worldwide, is because those musicians had to repackage multiple musical traditions, both from Africa and from the Americas, into something that everybody liked. And they succeeded sufficiently well that they made a world-conquering musical tradition, whether it's from Cuba, whether it's from Brazil, from Jamaica, or from the United States. African-based creolized music is a world music par excellence.
I think it occurred to me hearing Cheryl Joltz's comment, and Cheryl's a great friend and a great scholar of religion and a consultant for the history of the Black church. But she made me think, Barbaro, going back to our question about static and dynamic over half a millennium and how quickly things can change. Sorry, Abby has sent the thunderstorm that was at her house over my head.
Sorry.
So it's like thunder, lightning, and everything else. But just to give you a couple examples in the Black tradition, we know the first Africans came to Florida in 1526, and then the first Africans came to British North America in 1619. Over about 100 years, the Anglicans wouldn't even convert the Africans. They had huge debates, and it culminates with Morgan Godwin writing a book in 1680 saying, these people really are human beings because they could read and write and laugh. They had risibility, engage in the trades, and we could convert them, but that doesn't mean that we will free them. Then in 1750, it's the height of the Great Awakening. And 59% of the Africans, Barbaro, came to the United States after 1750, which is one of the great things about the transatlantic slave trade. And then you realize, oh my God, the Methodists and the Baptists are welcoming these new arrivants with open arms into the Christian faith, whereas the Anglicans weren't doing it a century before. And the first and the oldest African-American denomination is the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which is really the Methodist Episcopal Church made Black. Then it would change. And then another seismic shift occurs in 1895 with the founding of the National Baptist Convention. And how quickly did that change occur? Within 10 years, 61.4% of all African Americans were Baptist, with more than 2.2 million members in a 10-year period. And then in 1895 to 1897, the Church of God in Christ is born. Now the Church of God in Christ has 100 million members around the world. All I'm saying is that these paradigm shifts can occur very, very quickly, and it's difficult to historicize, or important that we historicize and try to allow for how slowly or quickly change could occur. It's a long way, in other words, between 1619 and 1895, just in the African-American context, let alone in Congo and Angola.
No, and I understand that. I think is that my observation was how we make a decision, what kind of source is more stable than other. And I think that for me is problematic. But even when you have the Baptist church that collects a lot of material, and the 3 generations of the Grenfell, the last one who served in Angola until I think 1989 or 1992, the 3 his father and his grandfather who used to write for the newsletter for the Baptist church, producing in Mbanza Kongo and circulating in London to all of the churches in the world in this very violent language, talking about evil, devil practice and so forth. At the same time, they are writing books about the local religions, and they never shared those kind of information with the church. And they are unpublished now in Regent Park College at Oxford. 3 generations, or over 80 years, a 3 generation of priests from the Baptist church. They have an incredible interest in the religion. They write books, manuscripts. They don't share with anyone, but at the same time, they write in this horrible language about burning, authorizing burning 1,000 objects.
Oh, of course.
Twice
Yeah.
in 5 years is just tell you.
Oh, yeah, but they're writing in the colonial period, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Which is after 1880. Again, there's 1491, there's 1600, then there's a colonial period, and then there's 50 years ago when you're born. There's a lot of time for change there. And I think that the answer about the sources, Barbara, and surely you agree with this, is that we have to use both. We have to use the oral tradition. We have to use the printed sources, no matter who wrote them. We could put them under scrutiny, but we have to use whatever record was left in order to piece together the three dimensions of the story.
No, I'm not saying the opposite to that. I just make an observation.
Well, I think you should get those manuscripts, if you can, published, that are buried in the Oxford Library, right?
No, I have it. I have copies.
No, but you're going to publish them so we all can read them.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a book about Congo religions and
I know.
graphic writing system. It just
yeah, but I want you to get those original sources out. You and I happen to be in Angola talking about this matter.
Yeah.
On film. So I know your biography and bibliography. And I remember when Thompson turned from Yoruba to Congo, it was a big paradigm shift for him in terms of his thinking about influence in the New World. And when he did 4 Moments of the Sun, I drove all from New Haven to Washington just for the opening of that. And that catalog was amazing. And it made his work a lot more nuanced because we all took his course. In 1969, that was the first year a lot of Black kids came to Yale. And as Barbara mentioned in the seminar last month, you can date the institutional presence of African history in a history of art department to Bob Thompson at Yale. I mean, he was an undergraduate there and a graduate student, and then an assistant, associate, and then a full professor. So 2 years later, it's the first large class of Black kids come to Yale. And we all took Robert Ferris Thompson's class.
you.